Hey, it's time for a glass of OJ with OJ. Odd job. So, today I want to talk about security event management and incident. Don't forget the I. There's an I in the word SIM. And it doesn't stand for you. It doesn't stand for me. It stands for I. Incident. So what we want to think about is we have all these logs coming into this collection pool. And we have this wonderful engine that can take all of these logs and really make it say something for us. We can really make these logs indicate a lot of things to us, right? So the question we have to answer first, though, is what are we actually wanting to alert on? What are we actually interested in? And some of this should have already been inherent because you've hopefully already brought in log sources of things you're interested in protecting or things that help you determine whether an asset has been compromised or help you out in an investigation. So things like the firewall logs, things like DNS, things like all the 4624, 4625 Windows event logs or the log-on, log-offs, or login failures that users have on their systems. It could be proxy. It could be AV. It could be anything you want, really, just going on in there. It could be web server logs. It could be your web application firewall logs. It could be IPS and IDS. A lot of people have Snort running out there, or SourceFire, or pick your favorite, and they're running those. And so the question now is, okay, we have all these logs, we have all this stuff, and this SIM is able to take all these logs and pull it all in and look at it, correlate the different events that are happening, and hopefully be able to tell us if we're seeing an event we should be interested in investigating further. So first thing we want to do, of course, we've got log sources, some basic ones maybe, and maybe you're interested in some of the other log sources as well. But a few questions you need to ask first. The first question you want to ask yourself before you start saying, oh, well, we need this alert, and 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 we need L1 to close these in so quick a time. We need L2 to be able to escalate this time. We want L3 to be able to close these out and resolve in this time. The first thing you need to ask for any of those correlation rules, any of those use cases, any of whatever you want to call them, what are you protecting? What exactly would you say it is you're doing here? What are you trying to do with this use case? What are you trying to do with this correlation rule? And that's going to affect a lot of things, right? What you're wanting to protect. Because one event, so if you're wanting to protect a certain asset, that may be a lower priority event. If you see an authentication failure, that may be a low severity. Okay, so what? Sure, investigate it. Maybe it'll be something. Maybe it won't. But if you see if you see an auth failure to another system, you might go, "Ooh, now that's actually something we really ought to investigate." And this is actually a high priority because it's a high priority asset. If you're seeing, especially if you're seeing lots of login failures, right? You want to verify, was that a script? Was that you want to answer a lot other questions than you would maybe want to answer under another asset. So you got to be thinking, okay, what are we actually trying to protect with this? What is the asset? What is the interest, or what is the threat we're trying to mitigate here? What are the threat actors we're trying to defend against? And so what are their targets? Maybe you have certain threat actors in mind. Maybe you are worried about, certain TAs out there that you want to actually specifically target with these use cases and say, hey, we know their TTPs, so therefore we can go ahead and start looking for among these assets. But first you have to answer that question. So then the second question you've got to answer after that is, what does the threat model for that look like? Okay, so threat model is going to tell you quite a few things. So when you threat model, on the one side, and we talked about this last time for pen testing, on the one side, you have that asset that you want to protect. On the other side, you have that threat actor that wants to get at that asset. And you've got to think, either because you already know how this threat actor is going to work, or you know that common ways of getting to this particular asset or this particular interest, you can get at it through these vectors. So you have initial vectors for them to get in, whether it's some type of social engineering through a human clicking on an email or taking in an invoice or something like that. It could be even an on-prem attack, but make sure you're isolating this threat model to a degree to a single use case, or maybe to a couple use cases. It could be possible that after you threat model this, you're like, hey, we actually are going to need 3 correlation rules because we have 3 specific vectors that require different logic. But we'll get to that soon. And so what you want to do is you want to actually start looking at the vectors through. Okay, so you want to look at the vectors. Okay, now where are they going to move from there? Where are they going to move from there? And what steps does it take from going on from start to finish? What does that look like? And even through exfiltration, what might that look like? What might you do to exfiltrate data out of there? And how would you know? So you want to take this whole thing. You want to take this entire attack path. And then what you want to do as well, now that you've determined this is probably how the threat actor is going to go, most likely, right? And now you need to think, okay, what are the technical controls? What are the sensors? What are the log sources or potential log sources that are going to tell us whether or not someone's using this avenue? It could be there's a preventative measure or some kind of detective measure there that's supposed to stop something. It could be that there's a human process there, and at some point in that human process, there's something logged that kicks out. There could be a lot of things in between there that you want to gather, but obviously, things like email logs or stuff from your like Mimecast or whatever you happen to be using for your email protection, you want to be gathering that information into. It's a lot of data, depending on what you want. And so you want to start identifying these log sources. So this determines now that you've threat modeled, now that you've gone through and seen, okay, what are we actually interested in protecting? That gets funneled through a threat model with threat actors, right? You may not even have attribution for these threat actors. You might just say, okay, somebody is going to come in and want to do this. Now you have your visibility points. So now you've identified where are our visibility points for this, whether they're in your SIM already or not. What are the points of visibility for this? And then you say, do we have them in our SIM? If not, let's get them in our SIM. But more importantly, what are the specific log messages you are interested in? Because, if you're syslogging it in or if you're doing something else, you have the ability to prune those logs back, which allows you then to control exactly what you're looking for. And it, depending on which SIM you have, you may actually be on a situation. For instance, I know Splunk. It depends on how many gigs a day you want to index. Well, that's your license. Some people it's okay, how many log sources. Some people it's events per second. Some people there's a lot of different ways. But if you want to help get that licensing down, collecting only the logs that are interesting for your use cases is a good first step. Yes, there could be other logs you'd want for investigation purposes. Cool, identify those. But you know what first? Let's identify these use cases first. Let's identify these correlation rules first, because then that's going to tell us, through determining our visibility points, what we'd want to investigate. So the alert's fired, but what also might we want to investigate? Let's pull those logs in. What would we want to see? Let's pull those logs in. So once you've identified your visibility points, once you've threat modeled, once you've already figured out what you're actually protecting, come up with the logic. So what type of logs are you looking at? What threshold were you thinking about? Have you possibly simulated this attack and you know about what it should be? But kind of figure out some thresholding. And then give that logic, give that query logic, or give that correlation logic, give that over. If you have a SOC team that's managed service, if you have a SOC team internally, you want to go ahead and give that to your SOC team and say, okay, we need to be looking at these things. This is a detective measure that we need, and then we need some kind of response plan to this. So then while they're cranking away at figuring out exactly what you're going to be doing from the standpoint of actually creating the query, start thinking about the playbook. Start thinking about, okay, cool, an alert fires. What's the next thing I do if I'm L1? Thing I want to do if I'm L1, of course, is I want to see, okay, is this a false positive? So when you think of a false positive, the thing you need to think about is, what is a true positive? What are the things I'm actually looking for that's a true positive? And then you might also say, hey, these are telltale signs of a false positive, because maybe your query, even though you've tried to really nail down what you're looking for, there's a possibility for a false positive. No matter how tight you get it, there's always a potential for some of that to look like something bad, but on further investigation, it's not. So write out formally in a document for each incident, yes, for each correlation rule, write out, this is what a true positive looks like. This is how you validate this is an actual event. Once your L1 has determined, hey, this is not a drill, this is not a false positive, this is really something there, escalate to L2. What does L2 do? And maybe enrich the data in some way. But what L2 is going to do? Well, L2, again, going to do some further validation, just make sure, but also look at other data sources. They're going to look at threat intelligence. They're going to look at other things to determine, okay, what is going on here? What are the assets at play? They're going to start gathering that information. They might start looking at logon history for that. They might start seeing the scope of this alert, depending on if you're seeing like lateral movement or whether you're seeing a worm. They might start saying, okay, what does the scope? Is this the only endpoint? Maybe this is the only thing that triggered, but is this the only endpoint, or is this the only server affected? Maybe other servers are affected but haven't met that threshold yet. So you're wanting to get that information. And again, maybe there's a false positive. Maybe L1 says, I can't tell this is an L2, or I'm sorry, I can't tell this is a true positive. I can't tell it's a false positive. But it still doesn't look right. Well, give it to L2. Let L2 really take a deep look. Because again, L1 is about getting those things out of the way, dropping as fast as possible, as fast as you can. If they're, they should not be spending hours and hours and hours on investigating an alert. You need to hand that off to somebody. If you can't tell by the playbook, if you can't tell within X amount of time, minutes maybe, that this is a false positive or a true positive, you need to hand it at L2. Because L2 then is going to look at that. They're going to be looking at different logs. They're going to be looking at different things. And what they'll end up doing is hopefully sending that back down to that. But now you need to say what L2 does. L2 enriches the data. Ultimately, again, if this is, now they've got the impact. Now they've got the scope. Now they've got, hey, here's what's happened, the outbreak. Now we hand it to L3. L3 now is kind of that incident response, right? L3 is actually engaging the business. L3 is actually working with sys endpoint administrators to remediate endpoints. They're working on users. They're the ones who might go through, maybe L2 was allowed to, disable some accounts or reset some passwords, but L3 then is going to follow up on those, make sure that happened, and see what happened after that. So L3 then is kind of that coming in on the back end and cleaning it on up. Again, if then it's actually part of a breach or part of something more interesting, that's where your incident response plan then comes in. It's more formal. Start getting escalations for your IR manager or for your director, your CIO, your CISO, and on. But that's completely for another time. So you need to have that playbook. You need to have, this is how we are going to react to this. And you may even put time limits in there. But you need to say, this is what we're going to do to determine that this is a true positive. This is what we're going to do for a false positive. You need to have that already thought out by the time that your team comes back with the actual use case to start testing with the actual correlation rule. And set that up as a dashboard. Test it out. See if you're seeing anything. See if those things are actually real problems or non-real problems. See how effective it is. And then, of course, review the playbook. Make sure if it's a managed service, make sure your managed service is aware of the playbook. Include them on the design of it because they're going to know what their L1 and L2 people can handle. Maybe contractually they're not allowed to do certain things. So then you handle that. Okay, so once that's in place, we've got some metrics around this now, right? We already know that this is working, that this is hopefully going to be good. Put it into production. So we're going to put it into production, and there still may be some tuning, right? Now, this is very important. We're going to want to at least annually review each individual correlation rule. Each individual correlation rule. Take a drink of OJ. Because that is tough. Depending on how many correlation rules, that can be really, really tough. Because sometimes people have correlation rules merely because, well, compliance told us we needed to do this. Some people have correlation rules because, well, those were best practices. Our policy says we follow best practices, so they were doing it. But then what you end up doing is you end up having use cases that don't meet your context. You have use cases and correlation rules that aren't informed to your environment. They look too broadly at the logs and they fire on all sorts of stuff you're actually not interested in. You start getting alerts for users who really aren't doing anything wrong. It's not indicative of anything bad, but that's just the way that that best practice ends up getting applied. So we need to really take a look at those use cases and those incidents we raise and how we raise them every year, because things change. Maybe that asset you were protecting, so we go all the way back to the step one, maybe that asset you're protecting doesn't exist anymore. Maybe that program's done away with. Maybe it's expanded. Maybe that asset you're protecting is now part of a collection of assets of the same category, and you also need to make sure that it encompasses that. So now maybe you need to rewrite the rule. Maybe it needs to include more ranges of IPs. Maybe it needs to include logs from those assets. There's a lot of things it could maybe need. So you need to readdress those. And of course, hopefully you would address, more log ingestion. Hopefully you would address that when you realize, oh yeah, we have more assets. Hopefully it doesn't take you every year to learn that. But again, having an annual review where you actually do this will help you ensure that you always are staying on top of that and that nothing's getting by you from year to year, because a lot of people get audited year to year. So that's something good to do before your audit, is make sure you are tuning it up. And review your playbook. Is the playbook working? Review your playbook after every incident. Do a post-mortem. Say, what are our gaps, right? And so that should be part of every playbook, is here's the post-mortem on what we did. Here's what went well. Here's our gaps. Maybe it's a contact list. We didn't have enough contacts, and that caused a day delay in addressing this issue because it finally took us a day to find the right contact. Determine what went well, what could have went better, and what's absolutely failing. It's okay to fail. You're going to fail. There's always going to be failures. And so the big thing there is to identify those gaps, identify those failures, and that's how you'll start fixing them. The other thing then you also want to do is review the threat model. Maybe you have a new vector for that asset. Maybe someone decided to decided to open up SharePoint in such a way, or I don't know. Maybe someone decided to change the way we do VPN, and so now you have VPN directly to a new thing that you didn't before, and now that's another vector in. So there's a lot of things, or maybe your controls have changed. Maybe your points of visibility have changed. Maybe your control has changed from standpoint of now you're doing 2FA for this. Cool. So now maybe you need to incorporate 2FA, or drink a glass of OJ with some tequila with this. Maybe your company decided to get rid of 2FA. I've seen that happen. So maybe the company decided 2FA was too much of a hassle for us. Okay. That changes your threat model a lot, because now you've got other vectors. Now I'm really worried about the phishing. Now I'm really worried about some of these other ways people can get credentials to get access. You don't know that if you don't annually review, and review it through the lens of each of those steps I've given you. So And do that every year. It's a continuous improvement process. At least do it every year, but there should also be kind of some continuous, again, post-mortem of the playbook. Do we need to go back, change the threat model? Did we have something happen that we didn't expect? That'll tell you what was wrong with the rest of them. But that's just kind of my thing on use cases and incident response. Because otherwise you'll have if you don't follow these ideas, if you don't do something like this, you'll find that your SOC is wasting a lot of time and being overburdened with non-issues and things that you aren't actually interested in from a security standpoint. And so it's very important to make sure that you're completely aligning your alerting and you're completely aligning your correlation rules with things you're actually interested in securing and threat models that you've actually thought out. So that's my tip for you. That's my little spiel for the day, a little glass of OJ to hopefully strengthen our security's immune systems to make us all better. Tell me what you think. Go ahead and leave a comment. Talk to me on social media. And don't drink the Kool-Aid. Drink the OJ.